For nearly 20 years, Joan Rivers was the one person Johnny Carson trusted with his stage. She was the one he called when he needed someone to hold down The Tonight Show while he was gone. She was the one the audience accepted in his chair. And then, in the spring of 1986, she made one phone call, or rather, she failed to make one, and Johnny Carson never spoke to her again for the rest of his life. That's not a figure of speech, not an exaggeration for the sake of a story. Johnny Carson, a man who shook hands with presidents and shared a stage with every major entertainer of the 20th century, went to his grave in January 2005, having never exchanged another word with Joan Rivers after that year. No phone call, no letter, no message through mutual friends that was ever acknowledged, nothing. The silence lasted 19 years, and it was as deliberate and total as anything Carson ever did on camera. To understand how that happened, how two people that intertwined could end so completely, you have to go back to the beginning, because the relationship between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers wasn't just professional. It was, by every account from people who watched it closely, something closer to a mentorship built on genuine affection, mutual respect, and a shared language that only people who truly understand comedy can speak. Joan Rivers arrived on The Tonight Show for the first time in February 1965. She was 31 years old, relatively unknown outside of small clubs in New York, and terrified. Carson watched her set from behind the curtain before she went on, and what he saw was a comedian who didn't perform jokes so much as she performed herself, raw, unfiltered, relentlessly honest about her own insecurities in a way that was still rare for women in American television. When her set ended, Carson leaned into his microphone and said something that, in the world of late-night television, carried the weight of a coronation. He said, "You're going to be a star." He was right, of course. But what mattered more than the prediction was that he meant it. Carson didn't give that kind of acknowledgement casually. He was famously selective with his praise, famously guarded with his endorsement. The people around him at that time, Fred de Cordova, his longtime producer, and several members of the Tonight Show staff, all noted that Carson's enthusiasm for Rivers was genuine in a way that stood apart from how he regarded most guests. Over the next 2 decades, Joan Rivers became the most frequent guest host The Tonight Show ever had. She sat in Carson's chair more than any other entertainer, more than any other comedian, more than anyone who wasn't Johnny Carson himself. And she was good at it. The ratings held, the audience responded. There was a chemistry between Rivers and the Tonight Show audience that worked even when Carson wasn't there, which is not something that can be manufactured or faked. But here's the thing about that arrangement that everyone who watched it understood, even if they never said it out loud. There was a hierarchy. There was Carson's show, and there were the people Carson allowed to be part of it. That distinction mattered to him in ways that went beyond business. The Tonight Show wasn't just a job to Johnny Carson. It was, by the mid-1980s, essentially the longest-running artistic project of his life. He had built it. He had shaped it. He had turned it into the most powerful platform in American entertainment, and every decision about who sat at that desk, who held that microphone, and who spoke to that audience was a decision that moved through him. Joan Rivers understood this. She said so herself in interviews years later, when she had enough distance from the pain of what happened to speak about it with something approaching clarity. She understood the rules. She had operated inside them for 20 years. And then, in 1986, Fox Broadcasting came to her with an offer that changed everything. The offer was simple and enormous. Fox, which was still in the early stages of building itself into a legitimate fourth network, wanted Joan Rivers to host her own late-night program. The Joan Rivers Show would air opposite The Tonight Show. It would be Rivers' program, not Carson's. Her name in the title, her creative control, her platform. After 20 years of being the best guest host in the business, she was being offered the chance to be the host. The terms of what happened next depend on who you believe, and that ambiguity became part of why the wound never healed. Rivers has said in multiple interviews that she tried to reach Carson before the announcement was made. She has said that she called his office, that she left messages, that she made genuine attempts to speak with him directly before the news became public. She wanted him to hear it from her. She wanted to have the conversation that the history of their relationship seemed to demand. Carson's people, and Carson himself, in the rare moments he addressed the subject at all, told a different story. The version that circulated in the industry, the version that stuck because it aligned with how Carson operated, was that he never received a personal call. That Rivers went to Fox, agreed to the deal, and allowed the announcement to go public without ever picking up the phone and speaking to Carson directly. Not a message through an intermediary. Not a conversation that could be confirmed. A call that, as far as Carson was concerned, never happened. The distinction seems almost technical until you understand what it meant to Carson. He had spent 20 years operating by a specific code. You didn't make moves in his world without acknowledgement. You didn't take steps that affected The Tonight Show. And a competing late-night program hosted by his most prominent guest host absolutely affected The Tonight Show without a conversation. It wasn't about asking permission. Carson understood that Rivers had every right to take the Fox deal. What it was about was respect. It was about the acknowledgement that their relationship merited a direct conversation before the rest of the world knew. When Fox announced the Joan Rivers Show in May 1986, Carson found out the way everyone else found out. He read about it. People who were close to Carson at the time have described his reaction in various ways. But the consistent thread through all of those accounts is that it wasn't explosive. Carson didn't rage. He didn't make calls denouncing Rivers to industry contacts or feed stories to journalists. He simply went quiet on the subject, and that quiet, for anyone who knew him, was more alarming than anger would have been. Henry Bushkin, Carson's attorney and close friend for many years, wrote about this period in his memoir and described a Carson who processed the Rivers situation with a coldness that was more complete than anything driven by heat. He had been, in his own assessment, disrespected. And that was the end of the chapter. Joan Rivers made her exit from The Tonight Show official in the fall of 1986. She had already taped what would be her final appearance as guest host earlier that year, though no one understood at the time that it would be the last. When she left, there was no farewell segment, no acknowledgement from Carson of what she had contributed. She was simply no longer there, and The Tonight Show continued without her as if the 20 years had been quietly edited out. The Joan Rivers Show premiered on Fox in October 1986. It ran for one season. The ratings were difficult, the reviews were mixed, and the experience of building a late-night program from scratch without the infrastructure that NBC had spent decades developing proved harder than the promise of the deal had suggested. Rivers and Fox parted ways in 1987. The show that had cost her the most important professional relationship of her life was gone inside of a year. What followed for Rivers was a period she has described as the darkest of her career. The late-night world she had navigated for 2 decades had effectively closed its doors. Carson's influence in that world was total enough that his silence on her behalf was felt as an active statement. She wasn't blacklisted in any formal sense, but the warmth that had characterized her relationship with NBC and the Tonight Show ecosystem was simply gone, and she understood exactly why. In 1987, her husband and manager, Edgar Rosenberg, died by suicide. The combination of professional collapse and personal devastation produced a period Rivers has described as nearly unsurvivable. She had to rebuild her career from the outside, doing mall shows and regional appearances, anything that would keep her working while she tried to find a way back into the industry's center. She found it eventually. The red carpet interviews that became her signature, the fashion commentary that made her a cultural institution all over again, the network shows that introduced her to a new generation. All of it came from a woman who rebuilt herself with no safety net and no powerful patron after the most prominent mentor of her life had gone silent. Carson never commented publicly on Rivers in any substantive way after 1986. There were occasional moments where his name and hers appeared in the same sentence in print, but he did not grant interviews about the falling out, did not offer reconciliation, and did not reach out. Multiple people in Rivers's circle, over the years, made attempts to broker some kind of reconnection. None of them succeeded. The accounts of those attempts share a common ending. Carson was not interested. Rivers gave a notable interview in 2012, more than 2 decades after the break. in which she said that not reconciling with Carson before his death was one of the great regrets of her life. She did not frame it as his fault or her fault. She framed it as a tragedy, the kind that happens when two people are too proud or too hurt or too certain of their own version of events to reach across the distance before time runs out. Carson died in January 2005. Rivers was not at the funeral. She had not spoken to him since 1986. The question people ask most often about the Carson Rivers story is whether what Carson did was justified, whether a failure to make one phone call, even granting that the phone call was genuinely missed rather than deliberately avoided, merited a 19-year silence, whether the punishment fit the offense. Those who knew Carson well tend to give a version of the same answer, that Carson operated by a code of loyalty that was, by most standards, absolute, that within his world, the relationships he had built were built on trust in a specific and non-negotiable sense, that he had given Joan Rivers something he gave almost no one, consistent access to his platform, his endorsement, his genuine professional support, and that when he felt that gift had been treated carelessly, the part of him that maintained relationships simply switched off. It is not a forgiving portrait, but it is, by most accounts, an accurate one. What the story of Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers reveals is something that his public image was carefully constructed to obscure. The warmth he projected on camera, the easy laugh, the perfect timing, the apparent generosity with his guests, existed alongside a private architecture of loyalty and expectation that was unforgiving when breached. The Tonight Show was his kingdom, and the rules of that kingdom were not written down anywhere, but they were real, and violating them had real consequences. Joan Rivers spent the rest of her career understanding that. She rebuilt herself into something remarkable, arguably something more enduring than what she had been as Carson's permanent substitute. She worked until weeks before her death in 2014. She became, in the estimation of many who watched both careers, one of the most influential stand-up comedians of the 20th century, a distinction that doesn't depend on anyone's approval or endorsement, but she never stopped talking about Carson. In interview after interview, in her books, in her stand-up, the subject of what she and Carson had been to each other and how it ended kept surfacing. Not with bitterness, exactly. With something more complicated, the recognition that the relationship had mattered enormously, that what it became in its final form was a kind of wound that never entirely closed, and that the phone call that may or may not have been made was, in the end, the smallest possible hinge for something so large to swing on. Johnny Carson was one of the most powerful figures American entertainment ever produced. He shaped late-night television so completely that the industry is still operating inside the infrastructure he built. He was also a man who, when he felt crossed, did not raise his voice, did not make public statements, and did not negotiate. He simply removed you from his world, completely and permanently, and then continued, as if you had never been there. Joan Rivers was the one person he had elevated higher than anyone else, for longer than anyone else, and when the silence came, it lasted until he was gone. There is one more element to this story that rarely gets told, because it requires stepping back from the drama of the break itself and looking at what Carson did in its immediate aftermath. In the months following the Fox announcement, as the industry absorbed the news that Rivers and Carson were finished, Carson did something characteristically precise. He did not replace her. He didn't anoint a new permanent guest host, didn't signal to the industry that a new Rivers was being sought. He simply absorbed the role back into the Tonight Show's rotating guest host structure, as if the idea of a single person holding that chair in his absence had been an experiment that had run its course. It was, in its way, the final statement. Joan Rivers had not been replaced. She had been unmade. There were people inside NBC at the time who understood that move as deliberate, that Carson, by not designating a successor to Rivers's role, was making a point about what that role had been. It wasn't a permanent position. It wasn't a title. It was something Carson had extended personally to one specific person because of a specific relationship. And when the relationship ended, the position ended with it. The message to anyone paying attention was clear. This was never about the guest host slot. It was always about Joan. That is the story behind the public smiles and the late-night laughs and the 20 years of a partnership that looked from the outside like one of the great professional friendships in the history of American television. It was all of that, and it ended over a phone call that one of them says was made, and the other one never received. Which of them was telling the truth is a question that time has made impossible to answer. What is not impossible to answer is what the silence cost. It cost them both something that, by their own accounts and the accounts of everyone who watched it happen, could never be replaced.